So naturally, around this time of year, I've been reflecting on the process of repentance, on tshuva. And in Judaism, it's actually a pretty complicated process. Some people say it has 3 stages, some people say it has 4, some people say it has 6 or 7. But here are the basic stages. The first one is recognition, right? Because if you don't recognize what you did, there's no way to repent for it. The next is really important, charata, or regret. You got to feel badly about what you did, right? You can't just know it. You can spend years in therapy talking about yourself, but not really like feeling it. You have to feel it. The third, which is really even harder, I think, is confession, vidui. So verbally confess the transgression to the person that you harmed, or to God, depending on the category of sin. And then finally, depending again on the system you look at, is aziva, or determine never to repeat the action. And in fact, the real litmus test is if you're in the same exact situation and have the same opportunity to repeat the sin, and you don't. It's like, let's say eating chocolate cake is a sin, which it's not. And I vow, like, I'm not going to eat chocolate cake anymore, and there's a huge chocolate cake in front of me, and I refrain. So that's tshuva gemura, complete tshuva. But please don't think that eating chocolate cake is a sin. So on one level, this really is a profound process. It makes a lot of sense. And on the other, it's really complicated. So I decided to come up with a simpler system. Not necessarily to replace it, just something to serve as a simple kind of mantra in my daily life when it's hard to remember all the stages. And it's just 3 words: do the opposite. Whatever the problematic behavior is, the pattern, just do the opposite. A guidepost that's easy to keep in mind. I know it sounds ridiculously simple, but I think it's potentially meaningful. So let's try on this idea. We all know, I think, that trauma begets trauma. Abuse begets abuse. That the task of breaking intergenerational patterns of trauma is daunting. And I really understood these patterns once I had children and I saw how I passed down my stuff. But we can talk about that later. Indeed, we know from recent developments in science that trauma can actually leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, a process that's called epigenetics. I don't fully understand it, and I'm sure some of you do, and I'd love to hear more about it at any point. But it actually alters how genes are expressed. These patterns are so powerful. It's as if a script was written for us before we were even born. It feels impossible often to do the opposite. But that is precisely, I believe, what tshuva requires. To offer the most challenging example possible, this past Sunday night, I was at 92NY at a program called Holding On to Humanity, Bereaved Israelis and Palestinians for Peace. The panel was introduced by Rabbi David Ingber, who many of you know, and it included 4 people, 2 Israeli Jews and 2 Palestinians, who had lost family members in this never-ending cycle of violence, and had decided to join an organization called the Parents Circle Families Forum, which brings together Israeli and Palestinian families who have lost a loved one to conflict. Here are 2 of their stories. The first is from Rabbi. She grew up in South Africa and moved to Israel in 1967. She lost her beloved son David to the conflict. After serving in the army, David went to Tel Aviv University and studied philosophy and psychology, and then began his master's in philosophy of education. In March of 2002, he was called up for reserve duty and served at a checkpoint near Ofra on the West Bank, where he was killed by a Palestinian sniper, along with 9 others. When Rabbi heard the news, the first words out of her mouth were, "Do not take revenge in the name of my son." She didn't even remember saying these words. She said that people who were with her later told her what she said. Laila al-Sheikh lives in Bethlehem in the West Bank. In 2002, her beautiful 6-month-old son, Kusai, became ill, and Israeli soldiers prevented Laila from taking him to the hospital for more than 5 hours. Kusai died from the lack of timely treatment. On Sunday night, Laila told us that for 10 years, she could not speak of his death, not even to her own family. One day, someone invited her to a meeting of the parent circle. That meeting changed her life. She met others like her, bereaved parents, siblings, and children, and that began her path to becoming a spokesperson for peace. I personally cannot imagine being able to rise up from a chasm of personal grief to somehow find the capacity to connect with others across enemy lines and share my story, my heartbreak again and again. But these heartbroken warriors for peace are doing exactly that. They are doing the opposite. Instead of creating more hatred, more dehumanization, and contributing to further violence, they are using their stories, their losses, to create peace. So what does this have to do with the Parsha? Ki Tavo. In this Parsha, it opens with an incredible story of becoming the opposite. It opens with a vision of a simple farmer with a basket in his hand, standing before the priest and telling his story and the story of his people. He begins, and this may sound familiar to you, "An Aramaean tried to destroy my ancestor. Arami Oved Avi." Like any good Jewish story, it starts with, "They tried to kill my ancestor." He went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, but became a great nation, mighty in number and many. So from the start, trauma and annihilation define his story. But let's see where the story goes. "Now the Egyptians dealt with us and afflicted us and placed upon us hard servitude. V'yariu otanu hamitzrim, v'ya'anunu, v'ya'nu aleinu avodah kasha." We were oppressed, we were weak, we were exploited, and here the story turns. We did something about it. We cried out to Adonai, the God of our fathers, and God heard us. And Adonai heard our voice, saw our affliction, and our strain, and our oppression. Adonai took us out from Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with great inspiring acts and with signs and portents, and brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Eretz zavat chalav and udvash. And now the farmer says, "Here I have brought the best part of my fruits of the ground that you have given me, oh Adonai." And the Torah instructs the farmer, "You are to deposit it before the presence of Adonai your God, and are to bow down before the presence of Adonai, and you are to rejoice in all the good things that Adonai your God has given you and your household, you and the Levite and the stranger amongst you." So when you think about this, this is pretty unbelievable. This farmer becomes the opposite. He's been released from his trauma instead of being defined by it. He's able to receive the gifts that God bestowed on him and his people. The gift of a promise fulfilled, the gift of abundance, the gift of joy, the gift of having a story to tell. You could imagine he's so marked by the trauma of generations that he would live a small life in deprivation. But instead, he stands there and tells his story with a basket in hand, making an offering to the priest, making an offering to God. As I was writing this, I thought, why am I talking about joy? Why am I talking about joy in this sermon? Just this morning, I was at a rally for the hostages in front of the UN. I know that some of you were there as well. And I can't help but wonder, what promise has been fulfilled for our imperiled and threatened people now at this moment? What joy could we possibly feel? But even this morning, and I see a bunch of faces that were there this morning, we witnessed the opposite. We heard family members of hostages, dead and alive, who somehow transcended their grief to share their stories and fight for the remaining hostages to come out of captivity. I don't know where they found the strength, but they did. One person, Aviva Siegel, 63 years old, was released from captivity in November, and her husband Keith is a captive until this very day. But today, in front of the UN, she rose up for the remaining hostages and talked also of compassion for suffering Palestinians. In an essay published today in The Atlantic, Aviva writes, "I understand that I am one of the few people able to communicate the experience of being held hostage and the urgency of bringing the remaining hostages home. I take this role very seriously." Aviva understands that she has a capacity that others don't, because it's impossible to be traumatized for months on end or days on end and to tell one story, but somehow Aviva is able to break that mold and be the opposite. She tells her story again and again for the sake of her husband Keith, for the sake of all the remaining hostages, for the sake of peace. She does the opposite. She goes on to write, "My plea is simple. I don't want any more innocent people to die. I want this war to end so the hostages can return to their families and the good people in Gaza can rebuild their lives. I am asking the global community to help us bring the hostages home." Returning to the humble farmer in the Torah, his story maybe holds out hope for us, that one day we might live a life that's not marked completely by trauma, that we can stand in joy in abundance here and in Israel, safely in our land, in our homes, and do the thing that makes a person happy. It's simple. Being able to stand and offer the best of what you have. To stand in joy, in gratitude, in abundance. Right now, I think the stakes of tshuva are high. Right now, it's upon us to create a different kind of world that is not completely defined by trauma. That might mean little actions in your life, and it might mean big actions. It might mean taking a risk to reach out, to tell your story, to connect with others, to make an offering, despite everything. I know it's hard, and I know it often feels impossible and depressing and even despairing. But maybe if we start small with microscopic shifts, modeling hope, then our story can be different. Then ultimately, we can tell a new story, we can sing a new song. May we be blessed during these painful days with reaching beyond ourselves to do the opposite, to become the opposite for the sake of peace, for the sake of flourishing, for the sake of our people, for the sake of humanity.